One big battle may be over, but the war continues. The Syrian government celebrates the retaking of Aleppo. But what of other areas it's lost? Where's the next battleground? Or is it time for a political solution? This is Inside Story. Hello, welcome to the program. I'm Hazem Sika. Aleppo will be clean, the words of the Syrian ambassador to the UN, Bashar Jafari, on Monday. Barely 3 days later, the last rebel fighters and civilians were evacuated out of eastern Aleppo. The Syrian government announced victory after 4 years of fighting. State television was quick to show images of celebrations. The capture of all of Aleppo is President Bashar al-Assad's biggest success since the war in Syria began almost 6 years ago. It is a crushing defeat for opposition fighters who have been forced to retreat. So does Assad have enough manpower and weapons to protect the territory his forces have retaken, while at the same time trying to win back more areas? With the government now in control of all the country's major urban centers, the Syrian army will be contemplating its next offensive. Idlib province is likely to feature strongly. That's where many of the rebels from eastern Aleppo have gone. And it is one of the last significant areas controlled by opposition fighters in Syria. 200 kilometers southeast of Aleppo is Palmyra. More than 2 weeks ago, ISIL recaptured the historic city after initially being forced out in March. But when President Assad pulled out hundreds of his troops, it left the UNESCO World Heritage Site vulnerable. Since the loss of Palmyra, the army has been launching retaliatory attacks in Raqqa, which has been under ISIL control since 2014. Further to the north of Syria, Kurdish fighters have made gains in recent months. They now control areas of land close to the Turkish border. Well, time now to introduce the panel. Joining me here in the studio is Louay Safi. He is the chairman of the Syrian American Council and a former spokesman for the Syrian National Coalition. From Moscow, we have Pavel Felgenh, a Russian military and defense specialist, and in Tel Aviv, Michael Horowitz, director of intelligence at the geopolitical consultancy Prime Source. Good to have you all with us, gentlemen. So, Louay Safi, let me start with you then. This has got to be a huge blow for the opposition in Syria, the loss of eastern Aleppo.
It is a serious blow, but it's not the end of the war. Because remember, this is not a army against army war. This is rebel against a government that has lost, tremendous power, and relying completely now on the Russians and the Iranians who are fighting on the behalf of the regime.
Pavel Felgenh, a huge propaganda victory for Assad, but what is next for his forces and the Russian forces who are backing him?
Well, officially, yes, this is a victory for Assad and his forces, but in reality, it was the Russians in the skies and some, of course, on the ground, and the Iranian-led and organized and financed Shia militias, which were the tip of the spear that went into Aleppo. So it was massive bombardments, not only Russian, but a kind of a Syrian Arab army rearmed by the Russians, and with Russian specialists using very heavy ordnance, so-called vacuum or fuel bombs, to extract the opposition from their dugouts and tunnels that they've made under Aleppo for many years. So the siege war in Syria right now is kind of ending. It's a more liquid situation. But the problem with the Syrian regime is that it is still very weak. Its forces are not very numerous, and their morale and readiness is rather low. So capturing a city, most likely with Russian and Iranian help, they can capture any city, any part of Syria. But can they hold it? That's another very serious problem.
Michael Horowitz, is this a turning point in the war?
Yes, it is. I mean, Aleppo was called the mother of all battles by rebels. So we're talking about a city that has not only economic and military importance, but it was also a symbol of the fight against Assad. So this is definitely a turning point. Now, is this the end of the opposition? I don't think so. I think it could be the end of the opposition as we know it, meaning that Aleppo was a main stronghold for the moderate opposition, and that what we could see is the opposition sort of sliding toward more extremist, the more extremist component of the rebels.
Louay, Safi, where does the opposition go from here now? And does the battle now, as many people are predicting, turn to the Idlib province?
Well, I mean, let me make it clear. I mean, this war will not be won militarily. This is a political struggle. From the day one, of course, it took this military turn, because the regime was so stubborn and thought it can use its own military to defeat the revolution. This will not happen. In fact, the regime dug deeper and made the crisis more serious and possible to go beyond the territory of Syria. So I think it has to be ultimately, this is a defeat for all Syrians, what happened in Aleppo. This is a win to Moscow, because it looks at the whole thing as a geopolitical game with the Russians and its own prestige, and trying to set itself again as a major world power. It's a win to the Shiite regime in Iran, but all Syrians have lost with what's happened. But as I said, this is a battle. The regime has won a battle, but not the war. You could see again setbacks for the regime in different places, or even in Aleppo. I mean, remember ultimately that now the regime is, you're right in saying that the moderate forces have been sort of gradually being sidelined, and now you have the more radical groups that will fight to the end and will shift the battle from place to another. And I think this will not work the way the regime,
So you talk about the radical groups there. Isn't that part of the problem in terms of the perception? Is that many of these opposition groups, rebel groups as they're called, many people don't see them as that much different from ISIL in terms of their ideology and their roots in extremism and so on. I mean, is there not a perception problem there?
Well, there is a problem, definitely. I mean, the leadership of Fath al-Sham, which is the Nusra, became a new force, are not far away in terms of their ideology from the Islamic State, the Daesh. But the rank and file of that are made of people who have been attacked by the military, by the regime military, or by the militias, and were forced to the arms and of the radical elements. And so this is a problem. I mean, the whole approach is quite really counterproductive. It will fire back eventually if the Russians continue like that. It will backfire. It will empower the radicals. It will weaken the moderate, and eventually the Russians cannot solve it by bombarding cities and towns. They eventually have to destroy the whole of Syria. But the rebels can move around. Those who have been hurt really are the people of Aleppo. Many of them have no choice, really. This is their town. Now they are being forced out of their homes. That will create a new problem. And I think the Russian leadership has to change their tactics, or we are all doomed to have really a long-term struggle that will spare nobody.
Well, let's turn to Moscow on this again. Then, Pavel, Felgenh, there is a question, isn't there, of just how well equipped the Syrian government forces are to hold on to territory. And you mentioned earlier that they were largely a weak army, that they were very dependent on their foreign backers like Russia. What is Russia likely to do here?
Well, there is hope in Moscow, serious hope, that the fall of Aleppo will be indeed a turning point, and that there will be a realignment, a regional realignment, and a realignment inside Syria. That Turkey, Russia, and Iran will get together and kind of divide and rule the bigger Middle East and Syria. That Turkey will use its influence on parts of the Syrian opposition, the Free Syrian Army, and that the Syrian opposition will split, and the moderate parts with Turkish influence will turn against the radical parts. Right now, to the north of Aleppo, there has been a zone created where elements of the Free Syrian Army, also mostly Turkmen forces, merged basically with Turkish regular tanks and armor, and they're controlling a part of Syria. And maybe that part will expand, and maybe actually the Russians and the Iranians and the Assad people won't go to Idlib. Idlib will become part of the divided kind of into zones of Syria, and that would be opposition Turkish, but it will be not anti-Assad, it will be anti-Daesh and against the radicals.
Michael Horowitz, there is a fear, certainly aid groups have expressed this, that because of the concentration of rebel fighters that we're now seeing in Idlib, it's only a matter of time before the government and its allies attack there, and that's going to further endanger civilians. How real is that fear to you?
I think it's very real. I mean, what we've seen in Aleppo is a bigger version of a strategy that Assad has been applying almost everywhere. If you remember, there were similar sieges next to Damascus in the city of Daraya, and more recently in the city of Khan al-Sheikh, where we've seen regime forces surrounding areas, bombing them and then forcing them to surrender. And I think this is Assad's strategy, and this is a strategy that he will continue to apply because he's been successful with the help of Russia and with the help of Iran. So yes, definitely, I think we're going to see the same situation in Idlib that we've seen in Aleppo and other areas of Syria.
Well, it is not just the control of territory that is shifting in Syria. The diplomatic landscape also appears to be changing, and that's what we're going to talk about more now. On Tuesday, the foreign ministers of Turkey, Russia and Iran concluding a meeting in Moscow on the war in Syria. The United States was not invited and the UN was excluded. Another meeting, which will include the Syrian government, will be held in the coming weeks.
The next stage should be an agreement on a ceasefire across all of Syria, and right after that, the beginning of talks on a political settlement. We've proposed the capital of Kazakhstan, Astana, as a neutral venue for the talks. The presidents of Turkey, Iran and Syria agreed to this. President Nazarbayev has kindly offered this venue to create conditions for such work, and I really hope we will be able to make this happen.
So Russian President Vladimir Putin there talking about the efforts to find a political solution to this. Louay, Safi, where does the Syrian political opposition fit into all of this? Because it seems that there's two tracks that are working at the moment. There is this effort at a summit in Kazakhstan with Russian and Turkish leaders, and then there is the UN envoy Stefan de Mistura pursuing these talks on the Geneva side. I mean, is there any kind of overlap between the two there, and where do the groups that you are part of fit into all of that?
Well, I think a political solution is the best thing for Syria. We tried that 3 years ago. But again, the problem is that the Russian and the Egyptian and the Iranian wants Bashar Assad to be in power for reasons that are quite apparent. I mean, because he alone can hold this very sectarian regime in Damascus. But a solution would require a really serious change in the structure of the regime and real participation of the majority If this is not going to happen, and it looks like this is not what Putin is thinking about, then probably this will become a Russian Iranian colony. Syria will be transformed into a colony maintained only by external forces. And
what do you mean by colony?
Colony, meaning the Russian soldiers and military has to be there. The Iranian fighters has to be there for a long time until the whole geopolitical structure of the region is going to even be shaken further. And we are going to have a series of confrontation until, you see, the Syrians, I mean, I don't know how much, people understand how Syrians is not going to give up the rights. Yeah, they have to bend to the wind. And maybe the opposition will have to negotiate some way to restructure the current situation. But the Syrians will not give up their goal of having a full participation in this government. And that means that greater stability. I don't think the Russians have really the ability to maintain this situation for long. They will be exhausted soon, particularly the economy will not allow them to be that colonial power for a long time. And so I think this is very, very stupid, really, approach to the whole region, rather than empowering the people and allowing for democratic transition that will make Syria more stable, and it will relieve the whole region and make it a model. Now we have this attempt to pressure it into staying under the dictatorship of Bashar al-Assad.
All right. Well, let's put some of that then to Pavel Felgenh. I mean, what's Russia's end game here? Because they certainly don't want to be bogged down in a war in Syria for years and years, do they?
Well, Russia has already announced that it will keep Russian troops and Russian military bases in Syria for the foreseeable future, and apparently there will be also Iranian bases and Iranian military presence in Syria. But at the same time, we should not forget that there's also they're kind of planning to have Turkish forces and Turkish bases and military presence inside Syria. So this is a tripod, three-power solution, kind of. So that Turkey will be representing the Sunnis, kind of, and be the patron of the Sunnis in Syria. Iran, the patron of the armed patron of the Shias and the Alawites, and Russia kind of in between, and maybe Russia hopes to be on top because Russia is not Sunni or Shia, but Russia has its geopolitical interest to have a foothold in Syria and maybe use that foothold to spread its influence further on in the bigger Middle East.
So do you believe?
Sorry to interrupt.
Do you believe that Syria, Russia and Turkey are closer to being on the same page now when it comes to Syria, that they can find more common ground? Because in the past there were some bitter differences with them, with the two backing different sides in the war.
Well, right now, Moscow and Ankara are working together. The Russian military and the Turkish military are working together. Actually, they're having military operations very close, side by side, in Aleppo, and the Turks are just north of Aleppo, fighting Daesh together with elements of the Free Syrian Army. So, yes, there's a lot of cooperation, and there's serious hope, and that's what President Putin was talking about, that the meeting in Astana will produce some kind of blueprint for Syria to isolate the radicals, to split the opposition. So the opposition, the parts of it, will agree to kind of support Assad or a reformed Assad regime, because Assad is staying, and that's not negotiable with Moscow or Tehran. But they'll have also a say and a stake in the future of Syria, and they'll be under Turkish patronage. And of course, Turkey will also have the additional bonus that they could control the Kurds and see that the Kurds don't establish in the north of Syria an independent entity. So, and that's very important, maybe the most important thing for Ankara.
Michael Horowitz, what hope do you think there is right now for any sort of a political solution to this?
I don't think there is hope for a political solution. I think what we're seeing with Putin's effort to do a summit in Astana is efforts to solve the proxy war in Syria and not efforts to solve the civil war. And there is a difference. For Putin, it doesn't matter that the civil war goes on as long as tensions with important countries such as Turkey are resolved. And I think that's extremely important to understand. Putin is using Syria as a way to both gain influence for Russia in the region, and he is succeeding and sidelining the US, the UN, and all the backers of the opposition. And again, with a summit in Astana where you have only Turkey, Iran, and Russia, he is succeeding. So this is extremely different than a political solution. This is something that makes the conflict manageable for Russia and beneficial for Moscow.
Louay, Safi, in terms of the efforts to find a solution to this, the opposition and those who are backing them have always maintained that there cannot be a future Syria with Bashar al-Assad as leader. But there is certainly no sign that he is going to go now, certainly not after this victory in Aleppo. Is that something that they should consider dropping now, as you know, if they want to find a long-term solution to what's happening in Syria?
Well, I agree. I agree that Assad is not going away in the short run. But if he stays, then everybody will be worse off, including Russia and Iran and Turkey. And Turkey really cannot be, of course, Turkey is bending backward currently because it has been betrayed by the United States and its European allies and found the only way to prevent a destabilization of its own country is to ally with the Russians and the Iranians. But this is really not going to solve the whole problem. And the Syrians now, I mean, you are going to see, you know, the rebels are going to multiply, and probably rebels will be joined by other Syrians, because, you know, occupation is never a pleasant thing. It is humiliating. It is destabilizing. And Assad will always be you know, the man of Russia now. And, you know, he is now the person who is acting on behalf of foreign power. And probably even that will create certain resentment within his own power base. If this is the formula that's suggested by your Russian guest, this will not work. Of course, it will stabilize the country for the short term, but Russia is going to face the same thing that was faced by the Americans, and even worse, because Americans have more you know, economic and military power than the Russians in Iraq. And in fact, now, you know, these rebel forces are joined in the two countries. I mean, I don't know who is doing the planning, but this is a very bad plan.
Michael Horowitz, I'm going to give what's probably going to be the last word to you, just in the less than a minute that we have left. How do you see all of this playing out as we enter 2017?
I think we're going to see something that is going to really impact the situation in Syria is the return of ISIS in Syria. And I think it's very important to understand that what happened in Palmyra, the retaking of Palmyra, was not just an opportunistic move. It was an ISIS decision to shift its focus back on Syria because it was challenged in Iraq, and also because the fighting in Aleppo had weakened both the rebels and Assad. And I think this is something that we should be very careful and that we should follow very closely.
All right, and on that note, we're going to leave it. Thanks very much to all of our guests, Michael Horowitz in Tel Aviv, Pavel Felgenh in Moscow, and Louay Safi joining me here in the studio in Doha. Thanks very much for being with us, and thank you for watching. As always, you can see this program again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. For me, Hazem Sika, and the whole team here, bye for now.